Welcome, everybody, to the Center of Addiction and Faith. This is our monthly webinar. And this month, we're doing a little bit different special occasion because it's National Recovery Month. We thought we would do something in the evening during prime time, and we would go out and get the best person to present for our webinar that we could find. And we got Maia Szalavitz. So we're so excited to have you here, Maia. Thank you for accepting the offer to be here and to talk about what you know so much. I don't think we're going to get to it all in an hour, but what a treat this is to have you here.
Thank you.
So we have about 250 people who have registered for this. We'll see how many actually get on board, but I'm sure many of those people will watch the tape later. But if you're in the webinar now, we'd love to know where you're from, what city you're from. So just chime in, click the chat button, and just say your first name and where you're listening into from this evening. It's kind of fun to see where everybody's from. Also, during the webinar, if you have a question, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can click on that, and your question will go into a queue, and we'll get to those later in the webinar. My name is Pastor Ed Treat. I'm the founder and director of the Center of Addiction and Faith, and I'm honored to be doing this work. We believe that faith communities have not done a very good job of attending to the issues of addiction, and they're in a great place to do that. They could really be effective and do some great work to help people with addiction issues. And so we think if we could educate faith communities, they could help make a big difference in the issues that our world is facing. So we're glad that you're here, because by being here, you're part of the solution. You're part of helping make this world a better place. So thanks for that. Please note there will be a 30-minute discussion following the webinar. If you want to join that discussion, I will put a link in the chat page so that as soon as this is over, you can make sure you capture that link, because when this is over, it disappears. So if you're coming to the 30-minute discussion following this webinar, copy the link and save it and use it to get into the following discussion. Before we begin, let me just take a moment to take a deep breath, and let's say the Serenity Prayer. I'll say it out loud. You can join along in silence. God, grant us the serenity to accept the things we cannot change, courage to change the things we can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, accepting hardships as the pathway to peace, taking as Christ did the sinful world as it is, not as I would have it, trusting that you will make all things right if we surrender to your will, so that we may be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy with you forever in the next. Amen. Okay, tonight our webinar host, our master of ceremonies, what's our title for you, Tim? Soon to be father, I think is the title. He's going to have a baby within a week. Our webinar tonight. Our webinar hosted by Tim McMahon King. He's the author of Addiction Nation. He's the CEO of Vagabond Consulting. He's a founding board member of the Center of Addiction and Faith, and becoming a friend of mine. I really, really admire this man. He's going to be the keynote speaker at our next conference. So we're excited for your new baby, Tim, and thank you for hosting this important webinar and for getting Maia to agree to be here. So I'll hand it over to you, Tim.
Thanks so much, Ed, and excited too about the upcoming conference. And Maia, so great to have you. And I know, as just a little introduction, and I hope for some people here too, Maia Szalavitz is an author and a journalist, and her last book, Unbroken Brain, was a New York Times bestseller, and was, for me, in my own understanding of addiction and substance use disorders, was a major shift to understanding addiction, and is thrilling to have you here and to be able to dive into your next book, Undoing Drugs, and diving into this history of harm reduction. And one of the exciting things with this is we just started off with the Serenity Prayer, is that in the history of harm reduction, there were a lot of people who had accepted some things that they thought couldn't change. And then there were a group of folks who came along and said, no, these things can change and they have to change. And that kind of vision is exciting. And to have you as one of the people who was helped by the early stages of harm reduction, but also was a pioneer in getting attention for this movement in your writing and starting off as a journalist. Most people look, when they start off in journalism, from what I understand, are looking for gigs that people are going to be ready to read. And you spent a lot of your early career focusing on some stuff that people weren't always ready to hear and weren't always ready to read. And one other thing that I'm excited about with tonight is that I really think with harm reduction, we know that it saves lives. We know that it can bring health to people. We know that it can prevent the spread of disease. We know that for some people, it's a path into some sort of long-term recovery. And for others, it's a path to a better, more stable life, whatever that means for them. But I also think that for this group in particular, harm reduction, I like to also think of as a prophetic movement, and a prophetic movement for faith communities, because it is based in some values that a lot of different religious traditions espouse, but don't always live up to. And what I love with harm reduction is its radical commitment to the dignity of every person, no matter where they are in their life. And so thrilled to have you, and also thrilled to have you as a person who, through your work in harm reduction, through your articulation of this movement, are able to provide some challenges to faith communities to live up to their own values. And so thank you once again for being here with us tonight.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
And so for a lot of folks here, they probably have signed up because they've either heard your name or are interested in your book or your work, or specifically in harm reduction. But we also might have some folks that harm reduction is fairly new to them. And so I was wondering, from your research, as a kind of an introduction, is there a story or an anecdote that you could share that really encapsulates the heart and the spirit of what harm reduction is?
Sure. So there's obviously many different definitions of it, but I see it as caring first about people not getting hurt rather than caring about whether they get high. And in my own experience, I was injecting drugs in the late 80s, and a woman happened to be visiting from San Francisco, and she taught me to use bleach to clean my needles. And I hadn't even known I was at risk for HIV at that point. And if she just said, well, you have to stop because you're at risk for AIDS, I probably wouldn't have listened to her. But because she said, hey, and she was actually visiting my friend to get him into rehab. And she could have just said, well, you got to go to treatment right now, but she was working with an outreach organization in San Francisco. And she knew that if she gave me practical tools that would allow me to protect myself, that I would probably use them. And that if I used them, I would be at lower risk. And then whether I got into recovery or not, I would still be HIV negative, which is better than being HIV positive, especially in those days when there was absolutely no treatment whatsoever. And it was, death sentence for most people who had it at that time. I mean, now it's become more manageable, but, back then it was horrifying. And we just saw people around us dying. So for her to just do that and say, hey, here's the information you should, I want you to live. And to me, that's the most powerful message. It's like, we're not judging you. We're not saying anything like, you must do this if we're going to help you. It's more like, we are here to serve you. We are here to help you because you are a human being who deserves dignity and respect like anybody else. And I am actually Jewish, but a lot of the stuff that I have heard about Christ is about that kind of spirit. And obviously we have it in Judaism as well, but it really is, about just helping people and not judging them and not casting the first stone and all of that kind of thing, so that you can fundamentally be there. And the thing that we've seen over the course of the development of harm reduction is when you treat people with love, they love themselves more. And when people love themselves more, they become more capable of change. And that change can range from everything to complete abstinence and complete turnaround to, maybe shooting up, once a week rather than every day, but now being able to be employed. So there's a huge range, but all of it matters, because really what we should be caring about is how can we make the quality of life and keep people alive and make their life better, not I'm worried that you are getting extra euphoria and that is bad.
The old adage about the puritanical Christian tradition is the deepest fear is that somebody somewhere out there is having a good time. But you start off right in the early introduction, I think, of your book, quoting from the Talmud. And the quote that the person who saves another's life, it is as they have saved the whole world. And so this is something deeply rooted in these values. And as you said, with Christ, known as the teacher who said, "Come as you are," and was criticized for hanging out with people who he was supposed to condemn. Can you tell us more about those values that underlie harm reduction?
Sure. Well, one of the things that our drug war has unfortunately done is demonize people who use certain substances. And part of the reason I called the book Undoing Drugs is because we think that alcohol, tobacco, and caffeine are not drugs. We don't think of ourselves as drug users if we take those drugs, even though we're drug users, and those drugs can be every bit, if not more dangerous than some of the drugs we've made illegal. And we had this idea that illegal drugs are illegal because they're more dangerous than the legal ones. But no, illegal drugs are illegal because of racism and anti-immigrant sentiment. And it's always been about controlling groups that we're scared of, particularly around not wanting them to have sex with white women for some reason. But that's a recurring theme in all of the propaganda around these drugs.
And if anyone has questions about that, Maia has the receipts in her book.
I know it sounds really bizarre, but it is fundamentally about fear of the other, and about fear that somebody else can take away your free will with this substance somehow. And we're still fighting with that. We're still having issues around this completely false belief. I mean, people with addiction certainly do get impaired and certainly are not making choices as freely as anyone else some of the time. But we are human beings that do make free choices. And one of the things that needle exchange and a lot of the other harm reduction things prove is, for a long time, people thought, oh, well, you're actively addictive, you can't use, you're not going to protect yourself, you won't bother. And well, look at the data. People bother, people protect themselves, people come onto a pathway towards better health by starting with safer drug use. And so it's really, we have to fight against this profound stigma. And some of that, or a large portion of that stigma, is rooted in racism. And the racist stereotypes that people have are very similar to the stereotypes we hold of people with addiction. And they're not true of either group. And this has been, you still see this all over the place. Oh, when is an addict, lying? When their lips are moving, right? Like, this is actually not true. People with addiction don't lie any more than anybody else when they know they won't be punished for telling the truth. And so, sure, just like people having affairs, they will lie about their use of the substance, just like you won't tell your spouse if you were, but that doesn't mean that you are a fundamentally dishonest person who's going to, lie about the price of coffee or something. And yet we have this horrible stereotype that, that dishonesty is part of addiction. And, again, we have all of these things about people with addiction just basically being fundamentally terrible people. And while I absolutely think that for many people, doing moral inventory, making amends, all of this stuff that we see in the 12 steps, that could benefit any human being. I have a problem with it when only people with addiction are the ones that are singled out to do this. Because if I went for medical treatment in any other form of, like if I went for depression and I was told, oh, go make a moral inventory, you know? So I feel like it ends up coming across as our systemic, another piece of our systemic judgment of people with addiction. And that's not to say that the 12 steps don't help people. It's just to say that it needs to be separate from the medical system.
Yeah.
Sorry, digression.
No, but a lot of folks here probably are going to be familiar with Father Rohr, who wrote Breathing Underwater. And one of the helpful things about that book was pushing to others to say, hey, the process that happens in the 12 steps is about being human and a process that helps humans. And it's just that there are folks who have some struggles that are going to be more likely to be condemned in our society, or be more obvious to us on the surface. But one thing that is very clear is this human tendency to otherize. And that happens, as you said, on a racial basis, with immigration status or country of origin. And it also happens with sexual orientation and sexual identity. And that a lot of the early parts of harm reduction was wrapped up with the HIV/AIDS crisis and the stigmatized groups, especially for gay men at the time, but all folks who are somewhere on that LGBTQ spectrum. And that was an early connection point. And can you tell us a little bit more about those early steps in harm reduction and that connection to the HIV/AIDS crisis?
Sure. So harm reduction in drugs comes directly out of the AIDS crisis. And I chose to start my book with the movement of harm reduction, where people actually came together and said, this is a concrete idea. We want to spread this idea in the world, and this is what it means. And that comes directly out of Liverpool in the late 80s and early 90s. And before that, in Rotterdam, there was a man named Nico Adrians who began the world's first needle exchange. And he also began the world's first drug user union. And this was before HIV was even identified. They were trying to fight hepatitis B. And he realized he was an IV drug user himself. And he realized, we can prevent this disease that hepatitis B at the time was killing people, even though it usually doesn't. We can prevent this disease if we just give people clean needles. And so they started doing that, and they got support from the government and from drug policy reform folks. And in the UK, when they had this horrible outbreak in Edinburgh, where the moment they started testing for HIV, they found half of their injectors were already positive, and they had this, sort of deindustrialization, loss of factory jobs, despair, all of this kind of stuff had hit Edinburgh really hard. And, their young people were injecting it like age 16 and coming down with AIDS. So Liverpool looked to Edinburgh and said, wow, we've got, economic despair, we've got job loss, we've got deindustrialization, we've got a lot of IV drug use, but we don't have AIDS yet. And so a group of people, some of whom were active drug users, some of whom were medical professionals and public health folks, they came together and they started one of the first needle exchanges in the UK. And they prescribed heroin. They even prescribed cocaine. They taught wound care. They did all of the things they could think of to do in order to keep people safe, so that they would be able to stay alive and improve at whatever rate they were going to do so. And so they got results. The UK never had a national HIV epidemic in IV drug users the way we did. And so they wanted to spread the word, and they called it harm reduction. They brought all those things that seemed kind of disparate together under the idea that we must reduce harm first. And Margaret Thatcher, bizarrely enough, said, yes, this is what we need to do, because they were really terrified that AIDS was going to spread from drug users into the general population. And they didn't stigmatize drug users as other as we did. They thought they were white people, basically. And so anyway, but that did become national policy in 1988 there, whereas in 1988, we banned federal funding for needle exchange. And we had the good fortune that some people from here were visiting Liverpool and were influenced by the Liverpool folks, and they brought the idea over here. And that's some of the basic origins.
Yeah.
It's more complicated than that.
And so with, both syringes, so this has been one fun thing for me. I've, brought some local pastors here in New Hampshire to our local syringe exchange who weren't sure about it, right? And as soon as they saw it in action, a light goes off and all those questions dissipate when they see kind of the process of what it looks like for people to build those connections, to build those relationships, to be affirmed in who they are, exactly where they are and their value, and that people care about them being healthy more than they care about controlling their behavior. Like that, it's amazing to see how, like, when someone experiences that, how quickly it changes. But it's also understandable why folks have some initial resistance, because what they're used to hearing is, all right, you're buying syringes, that's like a subsidy. And typically we subsidize things that we want more of. We don't want more drug use, so why are you subsidizing it? Or, one thing you just mentioned was heroin prescribing, right? Like that, again, sounds so counterintuitive to a lot of folks. Could you unpack for us
Sure.
why it might sound like this is going to increase, but studies keep showing it doesn't?
So in the United States, we somehow got it into our heads that you fix addiction by being cruel to people, by forcing them to hit bottom, by tough love, by consequences. We forgot that the definition of addiction is compulsive behavior that continues in the face of negative consequences. So if that stuff were to work, by definition, addiction wouldn't exist. So, okay, but we've been doing this for hundreds of years now. And we have this whole concept of enabling that, like, if you give people syringes or you're nice to them or you don't throw them on the street, that this will somehow help them. In reality, and there's many, many studies of this in terms of heroin prescribing these days, if you prescribe heroin, which is about the most enabling thing you could probably do, people are no less likely to get into recovery. In fact, they're more likely to get into even abstinence recovery, but also other forms of recovery. And their health gets better, crime goes down, people start to, what's interesting is what happens, because it's kind of like if you're actively addicted, you kind of dream of, okay, I could have access to the drugs I want and then everything will be fine. And what happens is, just like, you dream you're going to have this big success, your book's on the bestseller list, your life's going to be perfect, does not work this way. So,
are you sure?
Yes, sadly, I am
Okay,
sure.
exactly.
It's definitely, I'm not saying success is bad, but what I am saying is that when people with addiction get exactly what they want, just like everybody else, they get a bit disappointed. And they also tend to realize that, like, wow, I spent, all my time chasing this stuff, craving this stuff, avoiding the cops. It's like a career, basically. And now you just get it. And you have a lot of time. And you start to be like, okay, maybe I should get a job. Maybe I can actually go hang out with those relatives who, I didn't treat so well, and maybe I can, make amends to them or reconnect with them. So it has the exact opposite effect. And this is shown with, like, naloxone distribution for overdose reversal, needle exchange, heroin prescribing, safe injection facilities. Like, all of these things actually work to help people stay alive, and they do not deter recovery. In fact, people who participate in needle exchange are 5 times more likely to start treatment than people who are actively using and don't participate in needle exchange.
And so in your book too, you highlight something that for me for a little while about my own story I did not understand the significance of. And so I had been hospitalized for an extended period, was put on heavy doses of opioids, and eventually, while not inevitable, I developed a substance use disorder. And for a long time, I told the story of the fact that my doctor, when he sat me down, he said, "Tim, I think you're addicted to your pain medicine, but you didn't do anything wrong." And then he said, "And I believe you're still in pain. And I'm not going to cut you off from your pain medicine if you'll agree with me that you'll take less when you can." And now, at first, I just thought, well, like, that's nice of him. And then as I researched drug policy a little bit more, realized that there's a court case that went to the Supreme Court over 100 years ago that meant that what he was doing was borderline illegal. And yet, for me, as I look back, one of the biggest things when I came out of the hospital was my fear of that pain returning and not having access to pain medicine. And when he did that, my anxiety just dropped and I felt free to set my own pace. So could you tell us more about why what my doctor did very well could have been illegal, but why it works?
Well, I'm astonished that anybody had that experience in this day and age, because there's just so much pressure for doctors to do the opposite. And so many of them are cutting off pain patients who have no indications of addiction whatsoever, never failed a drug test, never did anything wrong, perfect compliance to whatever they are required. And yet, the doctor has numbers that they have to watch. So, oh, your numbers are high. You're the highest prescriber in the state. The DEA is going to go after you. Okay, they got that one. Now they're going to go after the next highest because math, So
somebody's always the highest.
Right. It's just ridiculous. But what it is doing to patients is absolutely horrific. And what your story says is precisely what the science says about how opioids work. The cat is now arriving on the desk.
My bloodhound is around, so I think you can tell.
Yes. So anyway, but so it is, opioids are part of your stress system. What opioids naturally do, your brain's own opioids, what they do beyond relieving pain is they allow social contact with people we love to reduce stress. And this is why mom reduces stress for the baby, and why, your partner reduces your stress with a hug, or all of these things like this. So this is what opioids are for. So the more control you have over your experience related to them, and the more empowered you are, the less stressed you are, and the less you need them. So what your doctor did was incredibly smart, because if you actually want somebody to successfully taper, if you give them control over it, they will do enormously better than if you say you're stopping right now and that's it. Because oftentimes what that will do, it will drive people to the streets. It has driven some people to suicide, and it is just the wrong thing to do, precisely because of the pharmacology of opioids and the way they work within our system of social connection. And it's no surprise that we're having an opioid crisis right now, because our social connections are just frayed all over the place. And for people who have nothing, they're going to give them a sense of safety and warmth and comfort, which is what we usually should be able to get from each other. But when we can't, or when mental illness or stress or trauma interferes with our ability to do that, this is, addiction risk is increased. But that I'm really positively surprised to hear that your doctor did that. And I really hope that more folks will be doing that, because it is so, if you actually want people to come off, telling them they can stay on and come back if they need to do is the best way.
And every time someone tells me that's crazy, I have to remind them that was what exactly worked for me. And the other thing that so my story of, developing a substance use disorder from a prescription, that's often covered in the media, but not actually the most common path. And that's also for me, I've got no love for big pharma. I have no love in my heart for the Sacklers at all.
No.
But there's also some misunderstandings
Yeah,
about
I mean, I
the
think,
role of prescription medication.
yes, I think that what people have unfortunately done is said, if pharma said it, it must be false. But the truth about prescription opioid addiction is that 80% of people who become addicted to prescription opioids were never prescribed them. They are using their family members' drugs, their friends' drugs, drugs they got from someone's medicine cabinet. They didn't get the drugs from a doctor. And of that group, of that 80%, something like 80% of them has already used cocaine, has already used amphetamines, has already gone well beyond, smoking a little pot and drinking on weekends. So most of the people who become addicted are people who are kind of looking for drugs. They are not people who, oh my God, my doctor exposed me to this. I was a happy, normal person with everything going on fine. And then I just fell in love with this drug. And so I had to give up my wife and my kid and my cat and all of that. And so, that typically doesn't happen, because typically, even when you're exposed to the most extreme euphoria, as a lot of people are, after surgery with pain care, most people are like, wow, this is intense. I like this, but they're not like, okay, I'm going to drop everything and go find a drug dealer. They typically have enough what they call of a stake in conventional society that they are not going to give up their life for some meaningless chemical pleasure. And it's only if you don't have those other sources of hope and meaning and ability to self-soothe that you seriously are at risk. And so it's really, I think what unfortunately happened with the narrative we have around the opioid crisis is that we wanted the white patients to be innocent. And so unlike those horrible Black crack users, they weren't doing anything illegal. They weren't seeking pleasure. They were just going to their doctors. And this is racist. And so, it is just not the case that anybody who becomes addicted is more guilty than anybody else. It is a ridiculous way of looking at it. If we actually believe addiction's a disease or a disorder or some kind of medical condition, we can't be having, well, these are the innocent ones and these are the guilty ones.
So it's that other form of otherizing folks. And with that, understanding that the crackdown on prescribing just meant that a lot of people who had some access to a prescription grade then moved to a street drug. How could things have looked different if we had taken harm reduction as a viable alternative to what we have right now with the war on drugs?
Well, okay, so let's think about this for a minute. So let's say you've identified a guy who's running a pill mill, and it's definitely a pill mill. These are not pain patients. He's doing doses for dollars. He's trading sex for drugs. He's got guns. He's doing all these other things that we know. It's not like a guy who just prescribed a bit extra because he's getting old or something. So, which unfortunately happens. But anyway, so we have a genuine pill mill here. Now we have a list, because in order to prescribe opioids or any other controlled substances, you have to have a list of the patient's real names, because they won't be able to get the prescription without genuine ID. So what do? What we currently do is we have the cops move in and arrest the guy and do absolutely nothing to help those patients. What we could have done, since we had a list of them, is call them and say, hey, we need to evaluate your medical situation. Maybe you are addicted and maybe you need buprenorphine. Maybe you need methadone. Maybe you want abstinence-focused recovery. Maybe you have pain and addiction and we need to get that pain treated. But we didn't do any of that. And we literally let hundreds of thousands of people just get cut off. And then we were surprised when, cartels and gangsters said, gee, this looks like a great market. I can now move into all these towns where there previously wasn't heroin and I can sell it because there's a market. Some of them went outside of the parking lots of these places after the cops busted them. It's just so ridiculous. Like, why do we think that, cutting off people's medical opioids would treat pain or addiction? And I mean, I was just actually looking at an article where some of the people who made the policy admitted that they knew that people were going to go to the street, but they're like, well, it didn't happen yet, so we don't have to worry about it. It's like, it's a predictable consequence of what you're doing. You're going to kill people. Like, how can you make this but so what harm reduction says is the first thing you do is reduce harm. And so that means if somebody's on a medical opioid, don't cut them off. Work with them to figure out the best possible way to reduce harm. Sometimes that will mean transferring them to methadone or buprenorphine. If it were legal, it should be able to mean maintaining them on whatever they're on. But there is this ancient Supreme Court decision that said maintaining the comfort of an addict is illegal. And that's why we have all these really intense and overly strict and harmful overregulation of methadone and buprenorphine. Because the whole irony of this opioid crisis is that we have two medications that cut the death rate by 50% or more if you stay on them. They are methadone and buprenorphine. They are both opioids. So, yes, pharma is evil and bad and wrong, but both of those drugs are generic. And methadone has been generic for like 60 years or something. So it is not about some pharma plot or that the pharma funded this research to show that methadone and buprenorphine actually save lives. No, this is all like government funded research, very old. Nobody wanted to pay attention to it because there was this idea that if you are still on opioids, you can't be in recovery. And I actually want to make a point to say why that's not true. So physical dependence is needing a substance in order to function. And you can have physical dependence from blood pressure medication. Diabetics have physical dependence on insulin. There are some antidepressants that will cause absolutely brutal withdrawal if you don't taper them properly. But nobody for any of those drugs is going and, robbing drugstores to get them or sitting around thinking, oh, when can I get my next Prozac? Those drugs cause physical dependence. They don't cause addiction. And addiction is compulsive drug use that occurs despite negative consequences. Now, opioids are a pharmacological category that is unique in that when you take a regular steady state dose, you get a complete tolerance to the impairment. This is not true with, say, alcohol. So if I replace vodka with gin, I am still going to have a person who, although they have a tolerance and are probably better able to take it than somebody who never drinks alcohol, they are still going to have some impairment. But with opioids, you could actually, if you're on a steady dose that's right for you and taking it at the right time every day, you can drive, you can love, you can parent, you can do anything. And so basically what you've done is you've replaced addiction plus physical dependence with simply physical dependence. And physical dependence isn't a problem if the benefits of the drug outweigh the risks, which is certainly true for methadone and buprenorphine for opioid addiction, and often for people who are using opioids for chronic pain, although some of them may be better off without them. We can't just take away their medicine and not give them anything else and assume that that's going to cure the pain.
So to follow up on that, and as folks do have questions, go ahead and drop that in the Q&A box in particular. So feel free to drop any questions in there. We've already got a couple that have come in. Are there any other big misconceptions about substance use disorders or about harm reduction in particular that you'd like to address?
Yeah, I mean, there are zillions of them, but the one I would like to address here particularly is the idea that harm reduction is incompatible with 12-step recovery. And many of the founders of harm reduction were in 12-step recovery when they founded it. And I remember, back in the day when I was doing that, I would annoy the heck out of people at meetings by saying, we got to do something. Our people are dying. Look, the gay people are doing something. Why aren't we doing something? But that's political and it's an outside issue and you shouldn't say it. So anyway, and I do get the reasons for that. Anyway, some of us decided that something had to be done. And so was it scary to go out there and be like around people who are actively using when maybe you hadn't been for a while. Yeah, like, I mean, the first time I went out and reported on needle exchange, I was maybe 2 or 3 years in recovery, and I was like quite anxious about seeing needles and all this. But I was also determined that, like, I am not going to be a robot who responds to seeing a needle by shooting up. You know, I might get a craving or whatever, but I am not going to like fall for that nonsense. And so I was, you know, I did my thing. I talked to my sponsor. I went to my meetings. I did all the things that I was doing at that time. And this is what happened with lots of the early leadership of harm reduction, because basically we recognize that dead people don't recover. And if we actually wanted to 12-step people, they had to be alive for us to do it. And then over time, we began to realize, like, oh, our way isn't necessarily the only way. And, you know, some people need abstinence. Some people need abstinence from particular substances. Some people need total abstinence. Some people can actually moderate. And that's okay, as long as, like, you know what works for you. And if that's the 12 steps and you are secure in your recovery, you can totally go out and do harm reduction and have absolutely no problem, so long as you do the things you're supposed to do, like call your sponsor and go to meetings.
So we got a question here from Reverend Al Sharp at Clergy for New Drug Policy. It says the failed war on drugs has been going on for 50 years. What policies and administrative steps can we call for and ask our leaders that will finally bring this war to an end? Said, obviously, steps towards economic justice and social compassion would counter the hopelessness and trauma that so often lead to substance use. But I'm looking for what we can ask for and do in a more immediate sense. Fighting for decrim state by state.
Yes. Decriminalization, I believe, is the next big step. Because I should put a money bet on this, but nobody has ever been able to give me a coherent reason for why we should lock people up for using drugs. Some people who still support it say, oh, we should put them in treatment instead. But we don't do that for possession, because we wouldn't be able to afford the amount of treatment that we'd be providing for the number of people that we're locking up for possession, most of whom are being locked up for possession of marijuana and don't need treatment anyway. So also, arresting somebody is not the best way to find who needs treatment. And the money we spend arresting people and putting people in jail could be spent on attracting people to effective treatment. So I just, like, again, the original argument for criminalizing possession is to, like, stigmatize drugs, stigmatize drug users, and send the right message. So now that we're sort of saying we don't believe in stigma and we should be treating this like a health issue, tell me the argument for criminalization. And if you look at the public sentiment, as we see in Oregon, people get that now. And so I believe we could go an enormous way by moving towards decriminalization. I think we will eventually need to go further, but in terms of mass incarceration, in terms of improving our treatment system, because part of the problem with our current treatment system is that about half of people in it are forced into it by the criminal prosecution system. And so that makes for not a very good atmosphere within treatment, because everybody's sitting there like this when you're like telling your story of horrible trauma, and that, you know, not very therapeutic, right? So you want to have treatment for people who want it. And I know a lot of people in 12-step know this from having mandated people there, and that can, if you have too high a proportion of that, that can really be a problem. So we need to make treatment have to attract customers, because it's so used to getting fed people that have no choice that it treats people horribly. And we still have so many treatment providers who believe that, you know, the tough love is what we need and we got to confront them and attack them, even though we have data that shows that the more you confront, the more person wants to get high and actually does get, like, there's one of these studies with alcohol, I think, and it's like the headline or the name of the study is something like, the more the counselor confronts, the more the client drinks. So this is not what we should be doing. And if we actually force providers to be able to have to get customers, then they're going to have to be nicer to them. And if they're nicer to them, treatment will get better and will improve. So, I think that decriminalization is a great cause right now, a great place to start and to put energy. Legalization of marijuana needs to happen nationally. We need to work to get people to understand why needle exchange and naloxone and all of these things that are harm reduction are essential. And I think one of the ways that we need to do that we haven't been very good at is when you go to a needle exchange, although you will immediately get that this is a kind and good practice, you also see people who are still in despair, still doing very poorly for the most part. When you go to a meeting, on the other hand, you see these people, they're cleaned up, they look nice. All of the dropouts have dropped out. In harm reduction, you're retaining the people who have the biggest problems. And so it doesn't look the way you would want it to look. And so a lot of people think that, oh, that must mean it's enabling, or that must mean that it doesn't work, or whatever. The thing is, like, with abstinence, you only see the successes, and the failures are invisible. With harm reduction, the successes aren't there anymore. So, because you're not picking up clean needles if you were abstinent, right? Or if you, or you're picking them up less if you're doing less. And so you're just not going to be seen. And this is a particular problem with methadone, because the people who are hanging out outside all day are not the people who have jobs and are just going in and getting out of there because they know about the stigma. I think we need to do sort of better messaging on getting people to understand what harm reduction is, why it looks the way it does, and why when you see it in action, it really is a spiritual moment. Like, I mean, I always feel that when you see people who are so ostracized and stigmatized and kept out of things, just being treated with a smile or kindness, you can just see the seeds of change right there. It really, I mean, for me, it's like this moment of grace, or whatever you want to call it, because you just see this, this change and this just human connection that is like what we should be doing if we're trying to be kind to people.
Yeah, even in just my limited experience volunteering, the amount of times that I'd see someone show up for syringes one week and they'd kind of wait for the other shoe to drop, and it'd just be like, go be healthy. And then within a few weeks, suddenly they're like, what other resources do you have? And to see that is a shift that happens in a healthier way when people are able to self-direct.
Yeah. No, I was just thinking about when I was reporting on the illegal needle exchange that ACT UP was doing very early on. There was this one woman who I saw one time I came there, and then I came back a few months later for something else, and I didn't recognize her. She was, 20 pounds heavier. She just looked like a different person. I mean, it's like when you see people who are newcomers in the rooms, it was just like, whoa. And, you do see that kind of transformation.
And if anyone is interested, we did do a webinar with Dr. William Miller back a few months ago. So if you want to listen to more about the role of compassion and the problems with the old confrontational models, have some great stuff there. Also have a question here from Reverend Gerhardt. And she says she's lamenting some catch-22s of no mental health treatment before addiction recovery and vice versa. So that difficult combination.
Yeah, and this is where harm reduction is great. Hopefully I'm not preempting the question.
So one other part, she said, folks who are functional enough to fill out then probably don't need, and vice versa. And the second part, which is good too, any alternatives for Al-Anon that you think are a helpful approach that doesn't include some of the extreme tough love pieces that we now know to be harmful?
Okay, so I would say CRAFT, which is community reinforcement and family therapy, is a kind of family therapy that is directly for family members and is directly harm reduction. It was created by a colleague of William Miller's, actually. And if you look up craft family therapy online, you will find some guides to it. I think the Center for Motivation and Change has some good stuff for families on their website. But if you search it, you should be able to find some material on it. And that is definitely, and I mean, some people actually do participate in that and Al-Anon, but it definitely doesn't have that tough love flavor. And it works towards, helping people slowly get people into treatment, not confront them and maybe throw them out if they don't do exactly, what you want. Now, remind me of the first question.
So substance use disorders and mental health.
Oh, yes. Okay, so this is where harm reduction is especially great, because there is a thing called harm reduction psychotherapy, and the Center for Motivation and Change and the Harm Reduction Therapy Center, but one's in New York and one's in San Francisco. There are others. But the idea is that some people are so traumatized or so mentally ill that until they get better coping skills or medication or whatever they need to be able to, get through that, they're not going to be able to give up the drugs. So you really have to meet the person where they are. And there are people who recognize that you can prescribe mental health medications to people who are still actively using, and there are ways to work with that. And there are also ways to do therapy with people who are actively using, and that's what harm reduction therapy focuses on, because it's about working with a person where they are and with their goals, which may be like, I need to get out of this crushing depression, or I need to, deal with whatever this trauma is that I'm facing, that's coming up for me related to my childhood. And, when you hear the stories of people with severe addictions, they often have these just trauma histories that make me want to get high before I finish even listening to it, because it's just like, it's just awful. So some of people like that are going to have to get the therapy to minimize the trauma symptoms before they're going to be able to even begin to try to give up the drugs.
So, sorry, we've got a few more questions in here, and I'll give you a couple at once because I know we're getting closer to 9 o'clock. What is your opinion on the work of certified peer recovery specialists in regard to harm reduction? And
let me just do them one at a time, others I'm going to forget.
Okay.
So for that, as long as they are actually certified by a good organization that understands harm reduction, I think it's great. I think that we need to value people in recovery who are peers. We need to pay them better. We need to train them better. We need to support them better. But I think that the best expert is somebody who has both personal experience and actual expertise. Because if you have just one or just the other, you can go terribly wrong. And I think, so certified peer counselors, if they have the kind of certification, I've looked at some of these certification things, and if they have the kind that actually emphasizes harm reduction and empirical evidence, they can be great. If you have people who are just recovery coaches and have just, the only thing they got is their 30 years in recovery and they haven't ever, opened a book, not necessarily so good.
And question here specifically about as being a parent. How do you have some thoughts on handling an adult child with a substance use disorder? In particular, how would you evaluate whether or not you feel whether or not that person's going to be living with you and what that relationship looks like?
I mean, my feeling on that is like that craft family therapy is really, really helpful for that situation that I mentioned earlier. And also just that, like, you just have to keep in mind your relationship with that person. If they live with you, are they hurting you? Are they hurting your family? If not, then there's a whole other, but if they are, you need to protect yourself and your family, and that's fine. And that has nothing to do with codependence or enabling or any of that stuff or tough love. It's about, you need to protect yourself, put your oxygen mask on before you help others, that kind of thing. Because, it's just, that's what works. And so, but with people, it really depends on your connection to that person, how you feel, how that person treats you, how you treat them. And, I mean, I think the whole idea of enabling is nonsense. And I think if somebody's living with you and you connect with them well and they're not ready to get recovery, but you're okay with that, or abstinence recovery, that can be totally fine. It really depends on, like, is this a conflict-filled situation, or is this a situation where you can kind of keep an eye on them and keep the naloxone around and all of this kind of thing. So it's really very, very personal, I think. And I think it's really important to, the best way to deal with like teenagers and adult children in particular is to really let them know that you care, not be focused on, because they can tend to think, and I did this when I was that age, just that you want to control them, you want to take their pleasure away, you don't want them to have any fun. The more you can ally yourself with them, and the more you can be like, I just want you to get better. Like, we'll try this treatment, we'll try that treatment. If it sucks, we'll try somewhere else. Like, we're not going to put you somewhere that's horrible and isn't working for you. So if you're on the same side, you can just do so much better with that, and you can distance yourself from some of the conflict. Hopefully that was helpful.
Thank you. And I thank you for all these answers. And I know we have a lot more questions, but we also have Ed popping back up, which means we are at the top of the hour. And I know also, for anyone who's on here before you leave, Ed does have an announcement about our upcoming conference. But thank you again, Maia, for this book and for being with us this evening.
Thank you so much. And I look forward to staying in touch.
Thank you. And Maia, before you go,
Sure.
I actually popped in because you said that we could go a little longer if we needed to. So I wanted to ask you, and I'm going to make an assumption here. Can you say anything about what's going on in Portugal and some of the things they've done with their drug situation there? I think that's something we can learn from.
Yeah. So, I mean, so they decriminalized everything in, I believe, 2001. And they saw a dramatic decrease in HIV infections, and no increase in teen drug use, and no increase in adult drug use higher than the rest of Europe where they're near. So in other words, it went up everywhere, but it didn't go up worse in Portugal. So therefore, it's obviously not related to the decriminalization. So but the thing that they did that was, there's several things that I think are worth noting. The first and the most important is that they massively expanded treatment. And they put all the money that they were using arresting people into funding a variety of different treatment options for people. And they have services so that people can get housing and food and the stuff that they need. They also, if somebody does get arrested, which they try not to do, but if somebody's kind of being obnoxious or something, they will bring them to what they call a dissuasion committee. And this includes like a lawyer, a social worker, and some kind of medical person, I think. And so basically they try to figure out, does this person have an addiction? And if they do, are there services that they want? But if they don't want them, they don't have to go to them. And if they aren't addicted, they'll sort of say, okay, go away and like, don't be obnoxious again. So it's, they still, they don't actually arrest the people. But if they come into contact with police in such a way that, they think drugs are a problem, they will tell them to go to this thing. And again, it's just voluntary. And so this is definitely a better way of dealing with it than, constantly cycling people in and out of jail. And one of the things I forgot to mention is just that people who've been in jail, when you come out, you are like at least 4 times more likely to die of overdose, because they don't give you medication treatment in jail typically. I mean, we're fighting for that, and that's another thing to fight for. These legal cases, all of them are being won because medication treatment is the standard of care, and not providing the standard of care is not okay. Anyway, it definitely does increase harm. And there's no evidence that it does any good, because if you look at arrest rates, they are not at all correlated with, like, different states arrest different, and it's not correlated at all with how much addiction or overdose the state has.
Well, thank you, Maia. You're leading the conversation. You're leading us all to a better place. I'm grateful for that. We need to do better. And what I feel listening to the two of you talk is we have a long way to go still. That's my sense, is there's a lot of work yet to do, but I think we can make some strides. So thank you for being here. Tim, thank you again for your wonderful hosting. I know that you do an amazing job. I felt like I'm sitting at the feet of 2 very brilliant people listening to the 2 of you talk. So thank you for the gift that you bring to this. We don't pay you guys anything, so I'm asking those who are here listening tonight, go buy their books. Tim's got a book called Addiction Nation, and Maia's got how many books?
Like 8.
So go buy all 8 of Maia's books to say thank you for her time here tonight.
And actually, there's one thing I want to say in response to we have a long way to go. In writing this history of 30 years of stuff, we have come a long way too. And I feel like people who are on the ground doing stuff don't see that, because they're in the day to day, and but we have come a long way. We do still have a long way to go, but I just want to leave you with that hopeful message, because that's what I found in my research.
Yeah. Well, the other piece too is it seems like some things have lined up in terms of racism and addiction, with the opioid problem, and now with the COVID making that worse, but then also with George Floyd and the racial unrest that we've had. We at the Center of Addiction and Faith have had a couple of webinars talking about the injustice and the racial oppression that happens with addiction, and through the history of drug policy and whatnot. And so that has been a real big eye opener for me in the last couple of years. And I think that's a story that keeps needing to be told, because I think as people hear that, they see the injustice of it and go, oh my gosh, that's just awful. We're doing that. It's awful. And we've been doing that, and we're still doing that. Yeah. So after the webinar here tonight, we have a post-webinar discussion for about 30 minutes. We're going to keep it exactly to 30 minutes because it's already late. But there's a link there. You can click on that. As soon as this is done, you can go over to that Zoom, and we'll all be able to see each other and ask each other questions. I want to say that we have a conference coming up in October. And with that conference, I know that there's some concerns about a COVID spike here. We did meet and talk about whether we wanted to postpone the conference. And we ran into a little bit of a problem with the hotel after having already postponed with them twice before. They feel like that we could do this safely, and they're not willing to postpone any further. So we have to go ahead with the conference. I just want to let those who are coming or thinking about coming that we're going to take extra precautions, and we're going to be very, very safe in that environment. So please know that you will be safe if you come. And then we know that there's a lot of people who would like to come or maybe not able to come. So we've offered this virtual option, and we did have a price for it. And we decided, you know what, we want people to be able to come to this as much as possible. So we are allowing people, we're taking the price tag off the virtual attendance, and we're allowing you to pay whatever you can afford to pay. If you like this ministry and have money, you can support it. Then be generous. If you want to come to the conference and you're a student or you're somebody who has less means, please come and give what you can. Whatever you can give is fine. And that's through our website, addictionandfaithconference.com. You go to the registration page, it'll take you to Eventbrite, and then there's an option for the virtual attendance. Those who already paid the full price for virtual, you have the opportunity to request some of your refund if you want to. We hope you don't, but we need the resources, but we certainly know that's not fair to you. So if you feel like you need some of your money back, please make that request and we'll honor that and apologize for that inconvenience. So I hope you come to the conference. It's going to be amazing. We haven't been together for so long. It'll be so meaningful to be together again and to share stories. And what's powerful about these conferences is how open and vulnerable and genuine people are, and how much we celebrate the gift of life that's been given back to so many of us. And also we challenge ourselves as the church to and faith communities to attend to this issue. I mean, it really is. You know, we have we have a spiritual mandate to care about people, especially people who are hurting. And I can't think of anybody more deserving of our care than people who are struggling with addiction. So I hope you'll come and be a part of that. Let's see. I think that's all I have to say. Thank you all again for being here tonight. And I hope to see you at the following Zoom discussion. And Maia, just be prepared. I'm going to be hoping to get you at one of our conferences as a keynote speaker. So
All right.
be
Cool.
watching. Yeah.
Thanks so much.
All right. Yeah.
Take
Thanks
care.
all.
Okay.
God
Bye now.
bless.